Welcome to a journey through some of the most terrifying haunted locations in Texas. Today, we're stepping into a dark and eerie world, where restless spirits still linger and the shadows of the past echo through every crumbling wall. From the tortured souls trapped inside the Jasper County Jail, to the chilling laughter of children at the Haunted School of Navarro, from the tragic ghost of the maid wandering the halls of the Menger Hotel, to the sorrowful spirit at Magnolia Winery, and finally, we'll end our journey on the Haunted Saratoga Road, where ghostly lights flicker through the thick, mysterious fog. Prepare yourself to uncover these spine-tingling stories that you'll never forget. Do you have the courage to watch until the very end? If so, let's get started. Let's go to the first story. The Haunted School of Navarro County. Deep within the rural stretches of Navarro County, Texas, there stands a crumbling, abandoned school building. The walls are scarred with time, and the windows are shattered, dark gaping holes that seem to watch anyone who dares to approach. Once, this school was filled with the joyous laughter of children, bustling hallways, and classrooms alive with learning. But that was long ago. Now, it is a place of darkness, a place that no one enters after sundown. The story of the haunted school is rooted in tragedy. In the early 1950s, a horrific accident changed the town forever. It was a stormy afternoon, the sky black with angry clouds, when a school bus carrying over a dozen children careened off the narrow road and plunged into the murky waters of a lake just a few miles from the school. The driver tried desperately to gain control, but the rain-slicked roads were unforgiving. In mere seconds, the bus skidded, flipped, and slid into the lake, sinking quickly under the torrential downpour. Rescue teams arrived too late. By the time the bus was pulled from the water, all the children were gone. The town mourned, and the school, once a symbol of hope and promise, became a constant reminder of that terrible day. It was closed permanently not long after, left to rot and decay, its hallways falling silent except for the occasional whisper of the wind. But the townsfolk say that the silence is deceptive. They claim that, on certain nights, when the moon is hidden and the air is heavy, you can still hear the echoes of those lost voices. The sound of little feet pattering down the hallways, the soft, eerie laughter of children playing, and sometimes, just sometimes, you might catch a fleeting glimpse of their shadowy forms flitting past the shattered windows. Forever trapped in a place they never meant to stay. One summer evening, a group of teenagers, Jack, Emily, Chris, and Megan, decided to explore the abandoned school. They had heard the stories, of course, but they were young and fearless, eager for a thrill. With flashlights in hand and nervous excitement bubbling in their chests, they approached the front gate. It groaned on its rusty hinges as they pushed it open, the sound piercing the stillness of the night. "Are you sure about this?" Megan whispered, glancing nervously at the darkened building. The silhouette of the school loomed before them, tall and foreboding. "Come on, it's just an old building," Jack scoffed, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "We'll be in and out. Take a few pictures. Maybe find something cool to post online. No big deal." Chris nodded, holding up his phone. "Think of it as an adventure." With a deep breath, they crossed the threshold and stepped into the abandoned school. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of mold and dust. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The floorboards creaked ominously beneath their feet as they moved deeper into the building, the sound echoing in the vast emptiness. "Look at these desks," Emily murmured, shining her light over a row of tiny wooden chairs and tables. Each desk was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if frozen in time. A forgotten math book lay open, its pages yellowed and brittle. The chalkboard at the front of the room was smeared with faded markings, remnants of lessons long since abandoned. "It's like everyone just left," Megan whispered, a shiver running down her spine. They wandered through the school, passing through classroom after classroom, each one more decrepit and eerie than the last. And then, as they neared the end of the hallway, something changed. The air grew colder, bone-chillingly cold. Their breaths puffed out in small, visible clouds, and the flashlights flickered, casting jumpy, wavering beams of light. "Did anyone else feel that?" Chris asked, rubbing his arms. "Yeah," Emily whispered, her eyes wide. "It's freezing." Jack glanced around, his brow furrowed. "Weird, it's the middle of summer." But there was no time to ponder. From somewhere ahead, a sound broke the silence, a faint, high-pitched giggle, like that of a small child. They all froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. Did you hear that?" Megan whispered, clutching Jack's arm. "It's just the wind," Jack said, though his voice was shaky. But then the giggle came again, closer this time, and with it, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. The group turned slowly, flashlights raised, and crept forward. The sound led them to the last classroom at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, swinging slightly on its rusty hinges. They exchanged nervous glances, then pushed it open. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, the beam of their flashlights struggling to pierce the gloom. And then they saw it. All the chairs in the room, at least 24, were moving. Slowly, steadily, they turned in small circles, scraping across the cracked linoleum floor as if someone were sitting in them. Twirling around and around, Jack's heart leapt into his throat. "What the hell?" he breathed. Taking a step back, a soft, childish voice echoed from the far corner of the room, sending chills down their spines. "Come play?" They whipped around, lights darting frantically over the shadowed walls. There, in the corner, stood a small figure, a child, no more than 7 or 8 years old. She wore a faded dress, her hair hanging in limp, tangled strands around her face. But it was her eyes that made Emily's stomach twist. They were hollow, empty pits of darkness. "Who are you?" Chris whispered, unable to tear his gaze away. But the child didn't answer. Instead, she smiled, a slow, eerie grin that stretched too wide. And then, with a low, guttural laugh, she raised one hand and pointed directly at them. "Run!" Megan screamed, the spell breaking. They turned and fled, racing back down the hallway. The sound of tiny footsteps pounding behind them. Laughter, high-pitched and mocking, filled the air, echoing all around them. Doors slammed shut on their own as they passed, and a shadowy figure darted through the doorway just ahead, blocking their path. "Go! Go! Go!" Jack shouted, shoving his friends forward. They burst through the front door and stumbled out into the night. Gasping for breath, behind them, the school loomed, dark and silent once more. The laughter had stopped, the footsteps had ceased, only the wind whispered through the broken windows. A hollow, haunting sound. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, trembling, Megan looked up at the building and whispered, Did we really see that?" But no one could answer. They fled the grounds, not daring to look back. To this day, they never speak of that night. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the rain batters the windows, Megan swears she can still hear the faint sound of giggling children, echoes of the souls trapped forever in that cursed place. And for those who dare to enter the Navarro County School, heed this warning: the children are still there, forever searching for playmates who will never come. And if you hear them call your name, run. Because once you look into their empty eyes, there's no telling what will happen next. Next we start the second story. The Ghosts of Jasper County Jail. Hidden deep in the rural outskirts of Texas lies a crumbling relic of the past, the Jasper County Jail. This foreboding structure, built in the mid-1800s, once housed some of the region's most notorious criminals, men and women condemned to a life of confinement within its stone walls. Over the years, the jail witnessed countless tragedies: prisoners who succumbed to sickness, desperate souls who took their own lives, and the eerie silence that settled after executions held in the dead of night. By the early 20th century, the jail was shut down, left to rot as time slowly chipped away at its stone facade. But the stories of what transpired behind its rusted bars were far from forgotten. The local townsfolk would whisper of strange occurrences at the old jail. They claimed to hear the rattling of chains late at night, the sharp clinking reverberating through the empty cells. Others spoke of disembodied cries that would echo through the abandoned halls, agonized voices calling out in the dark, as if begging for release. Occasionally, a brave passerby might spot shadowy figures wandering the narrow corridors, their faces contorted in expressions of pain and sorrow. Those who dared venture close always left with a lingering sense of dread, as though the despair of the long-departed inmates had seeped into the very stone of the building. One brisk autumn night, a group of paranormal investigators, Adam, Rachel, Mike, and Sarah, decided to enter the haunted jail and confront the spirits within. armed with cameras, EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, recorders, and infrared sensors. They were eager to uncover the truth behind the legends. But as they approached the jail's massive iron gates, a cold wind whipped through the trees, rattling the rusted chains that still dangled from the entrance. It was as if the old prison was warning them to stay away. "Ready?" Adam asked, his breath misting in the cool night air. "Let's do this," Mike replied, trying to sound confident, but his eyes darted nervously toward the dark windows that loomed above them, like empty eye sockets staring down. With a creak of old hinges, they pushed the heavy gate open and stepped into the shadowed courtyard. The building towered before them, its walls cracked and covered in ivy. Every step they took seemed to echo in the silence, the gravel crunching beneath their boots. As they moved deeper into the heart of the jail, the air grew thick and oppressive. The once clear night seemed to darken around them, as if the building itself was swallowing up all light and warmth. "This place feels wrong," Sarah murmured, hugging herself against the sudden chill. Rachel nodded, checking her camera. "Keep recording. If there are any spirits here, we'll catch them." The group moved cautiously through the entrance hall, the beams of their flashlights sweeping across broken furniture, old files scattered on the floor, and the remnants of what once might have been a guard's desk. The walls, covered in peeling paint, seemed to close in on them, and the eerie silence was interrupted only by the occasional drip of water from a cracked ceiling above. They descended a narrow set of stairs that led to the cell block. As they reached the bottom, the cold intensified. Metal bars lined either side of the hallway, the cells beyond cloaked in darkness. Each one was a small, claustrophobic cage, with rusted iron frames of beds and broken toilets. Adam paused, lifting his EVP recorder. "Is there anyone here with us?" he called softly, his voice echoing down the hall. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of chains clinking softly, like someone shifting restlessly in their cell. The group tensed, exchanging wide-eyed looks. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered. Mike nodded, aiming his camera toward the source of the sound. "It came from over there." They crept forward, the beam of their flashlights dancing over the dark cells. And then, just as they reached the midpoint of the corridor, a soft, anguished moan rose from one of the cells, low and guttural. The sound of pure, unadulterated misery. "Who's there?" Adam demanded, though his voice shook. But there was no reply, only the metallic clang of a cell door swinging slowly shut further down the hall. The group froze, every muscle taut with fear. Then, without warning, a high-pitched scream tore through the air, piercing the silence like a knife. It reverberated through the narrow space, bouncing off the walls in a maddening cacophony. "Run!" Sarah cried, backing away. But Adam stood his ground, lifting his camera. "Wait, we need to document this," he insisted, even as his own instincts screamed at him to flee. Slowly, cautiously, they inched closer to the source of the sound, an old cell at the very end of the hall. The door hung half open, its hinges groaning as it swung in the still air. Adam shone his flashlight into the darkness beyond, and there, huddled in the corner, shivering violently, was the shadowy figure of a man. His hair was matted, his clothes tattered and covered in grime. His hands clutched at his head, and his shoulders shook with sobs. "Hello?" Rachel called softly, taking a step forward. The figure stilled. Then, with agonizing slowness, he lifted his head. Red, glowing eyes glared back at them, eyes filled with rage, pain, and something far worse, desperation. Before they could react, the figure lunged, slamming against the bars of the cell with a force that rattled the entire structure. "Get out!" the man screamed, his voice raw and broken. "Get out!" The group stumbled back, terror clutching at their throats. But as they turned to run, a new horror unfolded. Figures began to materialize in the cells around them, faint, transparent shapes of men in tattered uniforms, their faces twisted in agony. They reached through the bars with skeletal hands, mouths opening in silent screams. "Leave us," they howled, the voices overlapping, filling the air with a deafening roar. Panicked, the investigators fled, sprinting down the hall, the wails and screams of the spirits chasing after them. The jail seemed to come alive around them, the walls trembling, the very ground shaking beneath their feet. Shadows darted in and out of the cells, fingers clawing at their clothes as they stumbled up the stairs and burst out into the courtyard. They didn't stop running until they reached their van. Gasping for breath, hearts hammering, Adam looked back at the jail, his face pale. Did you see that?" he whispered hoarsely. But none of them could speak. They piled into the van, slamming the doors shut, and sped away. The image of those glowing red eyes burned into their minds. The Jasper County Jail still stands, its stone walls cracked and crumbling, a monument to a dark and painful past. And though it may be abandoned, it is far from empty. Those who venture close say they can still hear the rattling of chains, the cries of tortured souls, and sometimes, just sometimes, they catch sight of shadowy figures pacing behind the bars, forever trapped in a prison of their own despair. If you ever find yourself near the old Jasper County Jail, take heed. Don't linger after dark, for the spirits that dwell within are angry, desperate, and they do not take kindly to intruders. If you listen closely, you might hear the faint whisper of a warning. Get out while you still can. Continue to the third story. The haunting of the Menger Hotel. In the heart of San Antonio, Texas, stands the grand and historic Menger Hotel. Opened in 1859, it has long been a symbol of luxury and elegance, its opulent halls having hosted dignitaries, soldiers, and presidents alike, including the legendary Theodore Roosevelt. But beneath its gilded facade lies a darker, more unsettling history. For while the Menger Hotel is celebrated for its timeless charm, it is also infamous for the restless spirits that linger within its walls. One of the most well-known ghosts at the Menger is that of Sally White, a maid who worked there in the late 19th century. According to the stories, Sally was a quiet, hard-working woman, known for her meticulous attention to detail and her kind demeanor. But her life was cut tragically short by a violent and jealous husband who accused her of infidelity. One stormy night, he tracked her down to the hotel, where, in a fit of rage, he stabbed her repeatedly. Sally died in agony, and though her mortal body left the world, her spirit remained, forever trapped within the place she had once called her second home. The staff and guests alike have reported seeing her spirit wandering the hallways, still dressed in the crisp white uniform of a 19th-century chambermaid. She is most often seen on the third floor, sweeping the corridors or quietly tending to the rooms. Her presence is ethereal and fleeting as a wisp of smoke, but it is room 201 that is said to hold the strongest connection to her ghostly form, a room where Sally's spirit seems to return time and again, as if drawn by some invisible thread. One chilly winter evening, a businessman named Richard Hall checked into room 201. He was in town for a series of meetings and had chosen the Menger for its historical charm and convenient location. Unaware of the hotel's haunted reputation, Richard settled in comfortably, admiring the antique furnishings and the way the evening light cast long, golden shadows across the polished wood floors. The night passed uneventfully at first. Richard returned from dinner around 10 p.m., changed into his pajamas, and lay down to read a book. But as the clock struck midnight, he began to notice an odd chill in the air, one that seemed to seep into the room despite the heater running steadily. Shivering, he pulled the blanket tighter around him, attributing the cold to an old building's quirks. But then he heard it, a soft shuffling sound, as if someone were walking quietly outside his door. He paused, listening intently. The footsteps were light and rhythmic, growing louder as they approached his room. Richard frowned. It was far too late for housekeeping, and he was certain there were no other guests on his floor. Curiosity piqued. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and padded to the door. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the handle. Then, slowly, he turned the knob and peeked out into the dimly lit hallway. There, just a few feet away, was a woman. She was facing away from him, her silhouette barely illuminated by the weak glow of the sconces on the walls. She wore a long, black dress and a crisp white apron. Her hair was dark and neatly pinned up, and she stood unnaturally still. "Excuse me, miss," Richard called softly, assuming she must be a staff member. "Do you need any help?" The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned, so slowly that Richard felt his skin prickle with unease. And when she finally faced him, his breath caught in his throat. Her face was pale, so pale it was almost translucent. Her eyes were dark, empty voids, staring straight through him as if he wasn't even there. And then, before his very eyes, her figure began to shimmer, fading in and out like an image on a faulty television screen. Richard stumbled backward, his heart pounding. He blinked, certain that he was imagining things. But when he looked again, she was gone. The hallway was empty, silent save for the distant hum of the elevator. He slammed the door shut, chest heaving, and leaned against it, trying to steady his breathing. It was just a trick of the light, he told himself firmly. I'm tired, that's all. But sleep, when it came, was uneasy. Richard tossed and turned, haunted by fleeting visions of that ghostly woman, her empty gaze fixed on him, her face a mask of sorrow and something darker, something like anger. Hours passed, and just as he began to drift off, a sharp, rhythmic tapping jolted him awake. He bolted upright, pulse racing. The sound was coming from the far corner of the room, where the antique dresser stood. Swallowing hard, Richard squinted into the darkness. Was someone there? His gaze darted to the door, but it was still locked. Slowly, he swung his legs off the bed, inching forward cautiously. The tapping continued, steady and relentless, like fingernails drumming against the wood. He reached the dresser, every nerve on edge. His fingers brushed the cold, polished surface, and the tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, suddenly, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper brushed against his ear. Why won't you leave? Richard gasped, jerking away. His back hit the wall, and he stared wildly around the room. There was no one there, nothing but shadows and the faint outline of the furniture. He scrambled back to the bed, every instinct screaming at him to get out. But as he reached for his suitcase, a figure moved at the edge of his vision. He froze. Sally was standing at the foot of his bed, her expression unreadable, her hands folded primly in front of her. She stared at him for what felt like an eternity, her gaze piercing through him, cold and hollow. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she raised one hand and pointed toward the door. Go, she whispered, her voice like the rustling of dead leaves. Richard didn't need to be told twice. He snatched his suitcase and bolted from the room, not stopping until he reached the lobby. Breathless and trembling, he stammered out his story to the night manager, expecting disbelief or derision, but the manager merely nodded, his expression grim. You've met Sally White, he said quietly. She's one of our more active residents. Richard left the Menger Hotel that night, and though he returned to San Antonio many times in the years that followed, he never set foot inside its haunted halls again. The memory of Sally's empty gaze and chilling whisper haunted him, even in the light of day. To this day, guests at the Menger Hotel speak of strange occurrences, sheets that are folded neatly while they sleep. Even if they were left in disarray, the soft murmur of a woman's voice drifting through empty hallways, and always, the faint sound of footsteps, echoing from somewhere just beyond the next corner. But they say that if you see her, if you meet Sally in the flesh, her pale face turned toward you, her sad, dark eyes staring into yours, you must not speak. Do not call out to her. Do not try to follow her. For if you do, she may take it as a sign that you, too, are ready to join her in her endless task, and you may never find your way out of the Menger's haunted halls again. And so the legend of the Menger Hotel endures, its beauty forever marred by the sorrow of the souls that cannot leave. Continue to Story 4. Saratoga Road lies deep within the dense and tangled woods of the Big Thicket in Texas. Cloaked in a veil of mist each night, this narrow, winding path has become infamous among locals as the Ghost Road. Stories of strange sightings and unexplainable events have swirled around this dark and eerie stretch of road for decades. They say it's a place where the veil between the living and the dead is thinner than anywhere else in the Lone Star State. It all began many years ago when a man known only as the Huntsman vanished without a trace. Legend has it that he was a seasoned woodsman who knew every trail and track in the forest. One stormy night, he left his cabin to hunt, promising his family he would return before dawn. But as the night deepened and the storm raged on, he never came back. Search parties scoured the woods, but no sign of him was ever found, except for his lantern, left hanging on a tree by Saratoga Road, still faintly glowing as if guided by an unseen hand. Some say his spirit, restless and confused, still wanders the road, forever searching for a way home. Over the years, many brave, or foolish, souls have ventured down this road, hoping to catch a glimpse of the huntsman. Some returned with stories of eerie lights floating through the mist, while others spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to choke the very air around them. But the most chilling encounters always involved the huntsman himself. One moonless night, a young couple named Sarah and Michael decided to take a late-night drive down Saratoga Road. They were coming back from a party, the laughter and music still fresh in their minds. But as they turned onto the winding, shadowy path, an uneasy silence fell between them. The thick fog swallowed their car, and the headlights barely cut through the dense darkness. Every few minutes, Sarah thought she saw flickers of light darting between the trees, like the reflection of eyes watching them from the shadows. As they rounded a sharp bend, Michael suddenly slammed on the brakes. Just ahead, standing in the middle of the road, was a man holding a lantern. He wore an old, tattered hunting jacket, and his face was obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. The couple sat frozen in disbelief. The man didn't move, he simply stood there, as if waiting. "Maybe he needs help," Michael murmured, reaching for the door handle. "No." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Something's not right. Look at his eyes." Michael squinted through the windshield. The man slowly lifted his head, and as the lantern's light spilled across his face, a chill ran down their spines. His eyes were empty, hollow sockets, dark, endless voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. Before Michael could react, the man raised his arm and pointed into the woods. The gesture was slow, deliberate, as if commanding them to follow. His lips moved, forming silent words that echoed in Sarah's mind like the whisper of wind through dead leaves. "Come with me." Panic surged through her. "We need to leave, now." But Michael, entranced by the figure, hesitated. The man's hand stayed outstretched, beckoning them closer. And then, without warning, the lantern's light flared, casting a blinding glow that seemed to engulf the car. Sarah screamed as she felt an unseen force pulling her toward the man, cold fingers wrapping around her thoughts, tugging her soul. "Michael, drive," she shrieked, breaking the spell. The tires screeched as Michael floored the gas pedal, swerving around the ghostly figure. For a split second, Sarah glanced back, and the man's empty eyes locked onto hers. The lantern's light flickered once, twice, and then, he was gone. Heart pounding, Michael sped down the road, the fog thickening around them like a shroud. But the nightmare wasn't over. Out of the mist, a blinding set of headlights appeared, barreling toward them at an impossible speed. Michael swerved to avoid the oncoming vehicle, only to see the lights vanish into thin air. He barely managed to regain control, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. What was that?" he stammered. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling, "but we need to get off this road." They continued driving, the oppressive silence broken only by the thrum of the engine and their ragged breaths. But just as they thought they were safe, the radio crackled to life. A faint, static-filled voice whispered through the speakers, words distorted and broken. It sounded like, "A man. Come with me?" Sarah's blood ran cold. She yanked the radio dial, but the voice only grew louder. A shadow darted across the road, and she caught a glimpse of a figure, his figure, running alongside the car, keeping pace with them no matter how fast they went. His lantern swung wildly, casting twisted shadows across the trees. "Michael, he's still here," she cried. Michael didn't dare look. He pressed harder on the gas, the engine roaring in protest as they hurtled down the winding path. But the huntsman wouldn't let go. His voice filled the car, a droning chant that wrapped around Sarah's thoughts, numbing her senses. Come, follow?" The air grew colder, the fog thicker, until it seemed like they were driving through a world of pure white. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The fog parted, the road straightened, and they burst into the clear night air. The radio fell silent, and the ghostly figure vanished. They were free. Michael pulled over, his hands shaking. They sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just happened. When they looked back, the road behind them was empty, dark and silent, as if nothing had ever been there. But the terror of that night would never leave them. They never spoke of it again. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would wake to the sound of a faint voice calling her name. And in the stillness of the night, she could almost see the glow of a lantern flickering in the distance. The huntsman still waits on Saratoga Road, a lost soul trapped between worlds. Those who dare to venture down that cursed path may find themselves drawn into his eternal hunt. Their own spirits bound to the dark woods forever. Locals warn travelers to avoid Saratoga Road after sunset. If you must pass through, do not stop, no matter what you see. For once you look into the huntsman's empty eyes, he will never let you go. And when the fog closes in, when the lantern light flickers in the distance, know this: you are not alone. You are in his territory now. And he is watching, waiting, for his next victim. So, should you ever find yourself driving down a foggy, deserted road late at night, remember the story of the huntsman. And whatever you do, never, ever, look into his eyes. Because once you do, the road home may disappear forever, just like him. Continue to the fifth story. The Phantom of Magnolia Winery. The Magnolia Winery, once the pride of Hico, Texas, stood as a symbol of sophistication and tradition, drawing crowds from near and far to savor its finest wines. In the early 1900s, it was a bustling hub of activity, with workers tending to giant fermentation vats and visitors flocking to taste its celebrated creations. But in the 1930s, an unspeakable tragedy shattered the winery's allure. A gruesome accident claimed the life of one of its most loyal workers. And from that moment on, the once vibrant winery was abandoned, left to decay into a hollow shell filled with eerie whispers and shadows that refused to be silenced. It all started with a man named Henry Walsh. Henry was known as a hard-working and dedicated employee who spent his days overseeing the fermentation process in the cavernous steel vats that lined the heart of the winery. His commitment to his work was unparalleled, and he took pride in each batch of wine that left the factory floor. But one fateful evening, a malfunction occurred in the largest vat. The machinery groaned, metal clanged, and before anyone could react, Henry found himself trapped inside the massive tank. Desperately, he clawed and pounded against the thick steel walls, his cries for help muffled by the hum of machinery and the swirling fermenting fumes. For hours, he struggled, his fists growing bloody as he battered the unyielding metal. But no one heard him. No one noticed he was gone, until it was too late. By morning, when the foreman unlocked the doors, Henry's lifeless body was discovered, slumped against the side of the vat. His face, contorted in agony, was etched into the minds of all who saw it. The news of the accident spread quickly, and soon, whispers of a curse began to circulate. Employees started quitting, claiming they heard the sounds of banging and faint screams emanating from the vats at night. The owners, desperate to salvage their reputation, denied the rumors, attributing the noises to the settling of the old building. But nothing could quell the growing fear. Within months, the winery was forced to close its doors, leaving behind only dust, shattered windows, and the restless spirit of a man who never escaped. Over the years, the abandoned Magnolia Winery became a local legend. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside, to brave the haunted halls and gaze into the gaping vats that once held wine and, some believed, still held Henry's tortured soul. Most never got further than the entrance, unnerved by the sight of the crumbling facade and the oppressive silence that seemed to seep through the broken windows. But some ventured deeper, and their stories were enough to keep the town on edge. One such group was a band of 5 friends: Mark, Jenny, David, Lisa, and Tom. They had heard the tales since they were children, and one night, fueled by bravado and a few drinks, they decided to face the legend head-on. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they broke into the winery just past midnight, laughing off their nerves as they pushed through the creaking doors. The air inside was thick with the smell of old, rotting wood and the faint, sour tang of aged wine. Dust motes swirled in the beam of their flashlights, and every step echoed ominously in the empty space. The vats loomed above them like silent sentinels, their dark, gaping mouths seeming to swallow the light. Jenny shivered and pulled her jacket tighter. "Are we really doing this?" she whispered, glancing nervously around. "Come on, it's just an old building." David scoffed, though his voice was tight. "Nothing's gonna happen." They wandered through the abandoned rooms, the silence broken only by the scuffling of their feet and the occasional creak of shifting metal. Then, as they turned a corner, they came face to face with the largest fermentation vat, the very one Henry had died in. It stood there, towering and menacing, its steel walls stained with time and rust. The group fell silent, staring at the vat in uneasy fascination. "Let's get closer," Mark suggested, his voice barely audible. They approached cautiously, the air growing colder with each step. Lisa, who had been recording the whole time, felt a chill crawl down her spine. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered. The group froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the oppressive quiet. Then, faintly, a dull thud echoed from within the vat. They exchanged uneasy glances. "Probably just a rat," Tom muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. But then the thudding grew louder, insistent, desperate, and with it came a muffled voice. So faint it was almost drowned by the pounding. Jenny gasped, stepping back. "Someone's in there," she cried, her heart racing. "Don't be stupid," Mark snapped. "It's probably just..." But before he could finish, the vat shuddered violently. A deep, resonant clang reverberated through the room, shaking the very walls. They staggered back as a blood-curdling scream erupted from within, a sound so raw and filled with pain that it seemed to pierce their very souls. "Run," David shouted, grabbing Jenny's arm. But they didn't move. They couldn't. A dark shape began to materialize inside the vat, a twisted, writhing mass that pressed against the metal walls. The thudding turned into a frantic hammering, and the voice, now clear, wailed in agony. "Let me out, let me out." With a screech of tortured metal, a shadowy figure burst forth from the vat, its form shrouded in darkness, eyes burning red like embers in the night. It lunged at them, and in that split second, time seemed to slow. Jenny saw the tattered remains of a work uniform, the blood-streaked face twisted in eternal anguish. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure roared, a sound filled with fury and sorrow. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. The group stood there, trembling, hearts pounding, staring at the now empty vat. The air was deathly still, and the only sound was the rapid, panicked breathing of the friends. "Let's get out of here," Mark whispered hoarsely. No one argued. They fled from the winery, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. As they burst through the front doors and into the cold night air, a sense of overwhelming dread washed over them. They didn't look back until they were safely in the car, the dilapidated building shrinking in the rearview mirror. But as they sped away, Lisa glanced at her camera screen and nearly dropped it in shock. There, in the final frame, was a face pressed against the camera lens, a face contorted in rage. Eyes blazing red. "Henry," she whispered, her voice trembling. They never spoke of that night again, but the memory of those red eyes haunted them, following them in every shadow, lurking in every darkened room. And the winery? It still stands, a lonely, crumbling ruin. Locals say that if you stand outside on a quiet night, you can hear the faint sound of hammering from deep within the walls. And if you're brave enough to venture inside, don't look too closely into the vats. You might just see a shadow move, or hear a voice whispering from the darkness. "Let me out."